What is happening, team? It's your host, Coach Hawk, coming at you live with another episode of Anabolic Radio featuring Alan Aragon, the esteemed gentleman and nutrition overlord, and author of this incredible book titled The Flexible Dieting Science-Based Reality-Tested Method for Achieving and Maintaining Your Optimal Physique, Performance, and Health. With over a decade in the fitness industry, he was kind enough to come on Anabolic Radio for another episode and take us all to school. So without further ado, Alan, how are you? How's life been? And how's life been since the release of your latest book?
Oh, bro, thank you so much for having me on your show. It's really a pleasure to be back on here. Life has been good. Life has been real busy with work. It's been a year since I released my book, and I'm really happy with the feedback and the raves over it. I mean, I did put like 30 years into the book, so it better get raves. But everything's been great, man. Just happy to be busy with work.
Mm. And since dropping the flexible dieting blueprint, flexible dieting, it's just called flexible dieting. Every time I go live or I get questions from people about recommendations for books on nutrition, I always recommend it off the top because it's a great resource. So if you're listening and you haven't bought a copy already, go snag one and support Alan. And for the basis of today's episode, team, it's going to be based around creating and individualizing, okay, nutrition protocols that are essential for long-term health outcomes. And, with today's current social technological landscape, it could be incredibly difficult for people to understand what they should be doing with their nutrition. You have a bull testicle guy telling you to eat raw meat, and Jimmy Johnson on TikTok, fear mongering about aspartame, and silly Susan telling you that seed oils will kill you. So, for some of the audience listening, Alan, how can they begin to strengthen their internal bullshit detector? And after your response, we could dive into different topics about each claim people make about specific foods.
Yeah, well, just as a general principle, when somebody is fear mongering against a given food or a given ingredient, or heck, even a given macronutrient, you can pretty much bet that people trying to scare you away from stuff are generally off base in their thinking and in their knowledge and in their approach, and sometimes in their general grip on reality. So that's your first red flag. If somebody is ranting and raving and telling you to keep away from this thingy, keep away from that thingy, this thing will kill you, that thing will give you cancer and seven other diseases. Just know right off the bat, okay, this person's probably a whack job, probably a quack. So that's the first thing you got to know. And the second thing you got to know is that in the nutrition space, people really thrive on alarmism and sensationalism. Their whole brands can just survive and thrive on just causing hysteria over issues that are actual non-issues. And 95% of the information in the nutrition realm is really just a bunch of bullcrap. Unless you're looking at folks like yourself and folks within this little evidence-based niche that we've got. Um, Everything outside of that is generally going to be crap.
So you mean to tell me people who go into grocery stores and point out chemicals in food is complete bullshit?
Absolutely. Dude, you don't know how many times I get clips from people send me stuff from I don't know his actual name, but Flav City. He it's like what on earth is going on here? And then you just look into the credentials of folks, the experience of folks, the knowledge, and he's just like a regular layperson who's just like reading off of a tabloid and then delivering it as fact, and it's just scaring people and dumbing down their nutritional IQ into single digits. And it's like, wow, this is fascinating. And then you see he's got like 1 billion followers. You're like, ooh, this is not a good thing. Uh, it's like he needs to get educated. He needs to get some help from people who actually know this stuff so we can put out better information because he's got such a big platform. But that's the biggest problem is people who have this level of charisma and this level of passion, they're the ones who get the biggest platforms. And unfortunately, a lot of those people are the ones spreading the most information. So most misinformation.
Mm,
So it's unfortunate. That's what the landscape is. But on the bright side, it gives you and me things to talk about and things to rectify and things to make right. And that's our glorious struggle in the nutrition and fitness industry.
mm, good points. Good points. So, when it comes to specific ingredients or shelf stabilizers that are utilized in things like cereals or even like different types of products, is there any reason for people to be fearful over consumption of a small quantity of whatever's in the product?
Yes, in the vast majority of cases, there's nothing to worry about. These little things, these ingredients, these preservatives, or these sweeteners, or the type of thing that is making the food taste better or more shelf stable. It's like you're missing the forest for the trees. How does this food fit into the larger context of the diet? Are you only eating this food in the diet, or is it a part of a range of foods that you're eating? And is the majority of your diet from whole and minimally refined foods? And is it mostly a wholesome diet? Well, if that's the case, then you're worrying about stuff to the point where you might as well take the position of just never stepping outside of your house, because
Mm,
then you might be breathing the air that's within 500 yards of a freeway. You know what I mean?
mm,
So, yeah, people miss the forest for the trees and they're missing the big rocks and focusing on the little grains of sand here.
mm. And I think something that's incredibly important that's worth recognizing is if you're probably tuned into this and you're familiar with Alan, you're familiar with myself, you're likely someone who tries to be aware of what you're doing with your nutrition. But for most of the population, there's a lot of people who tend to be food insecure. So they don't necessarily have the appropriate resources to be meticulous with their food selection. And that would prompt them to maybe go for some of these cheaper, more, processed type foods, which there's nothing necessarily wrong with processed type foods. I always like to tell people the dose makes the poison. So as long as you're making sure you're getting some vegetables in, you're making sure you're getting a sufficient amount of protein in, there's nothing to be incredibly worried about. And when it comes to the creation or individualization of a nutrition protocol, you get people who tend to be very tribalistic with different approaches, whether it be keto or carnivore or hunter gatherer diet, the latest and greatest. And I always tell people, as long as calories and macros are equated, it doesn't really matter. And we see that in the literature as well. And when it comes to people trying to create their own nutritional system, what are some tips you have for the audience?
Well, you bring up individualization, and that is the key because there are various programming elements for diet and, of course, training as well. That the better you individualize it, then the better you set the person up to enjoy the program and actually stick to it for more than a few weeks. They can actually stick to it as a matter of lifestyle. And so the elements that are available for individualizing are many. Right? We can even begin with the macronutrients. So protein is the least negotiable, I guess you could say, of in terms of individualization, but it's still a wide range. that benefits a broad range of populations. So on the lower end, you can look at amounts as low as like 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight that would serve the general population just fine for the most part. And then when you start looking at training populations and populations sustaining a caloric deficit, populations sustaining a caloric deficit while training, athletic populations, competitive athletic populations, then you start getting into the sweet spot or the optimal range of protein intake, which is more like 1.6 to 2.2 and occasionally more protein uh, in terms of grams per kilogram per day. So even that, protein can be individualized. Carbohydrate and fat proportion can be individualized with a low end of as little as a third of a gram of fat per pound of target body weight, all the way up to a full gram per pound of target body weight with dietary fat. There's a huge range there that would suit the needs of a broad range of individuals and goals and preferences. Carbohydrate, if you're somebody who prefers a low carb or even a very low carb ketogenic model, great, have at it. If you're somebody who prefers a high carb, low fat model, hey, that's your preference, that suits your goals, go for it. So these things can be individualized and should be individualized. And that is the key to having people look forward to their plan. And that is the key for people to be able to sustain their plan for as a matter of a lifestyle instead of a matter of just a phase. And then there are other elements for individualization that you can get into, like for example, linear dieting versus non-linear dieting. Um, there's you can talk about the various intermittent fasting models versus the just linear caloric restriction. That too has to be individualized. Nutrient timing within a day, that can be individualized. Another way to individualize the diet is to individualize accountability methods, accountability tactics, individualize the tracking approach, individualize the level of micromanagement that somebody engages with the respect to their dietary approach, individualize the quantitative versus qualitative approach. So there's so many ways, bro, to individualize the program, including the individualization of tracking progress. So
Mm,
yes, it is all about individualization. Yes.
mm. And I guess it really comes down to selecting an approach that works based off your dietary preferences and allows you to adhere to things long term. So if you're someone who enjoys eating carbs, you don't necessarily have to eliminate an entire macronutrient group in order to make progress. And those are essential points to take into account. And when it comes to tracking your macros, I guess some people will have some pushback to tracking their calories and tracking their macros. And if you haven't gotten to that point where you're comfortable enough to track your calories and track your macros consistently for whatever reason, it's really as simple as making sure you're getting, at least a palm size or at least 6 to 8 ounces of protein in a given meal, and making sure you're spreading your protein distribution throughout the duration of the day, getting some fruits, getting some veg in, and making sure your meal composition is perfectly allocated with enough carbs, fats, and protein. And if you've done that for a certain period of time, eventually you'll get to a point where you want to potentiate a bit more progress, and that's where the value of tracking your macros comes into play. And when it comes to specific approaches, you'll have a carnivore camp that says no eating vegetables, only meats, and internal organs for micronutrients. What are some responses you have for some of those people?
God. All right. So the carnivore population, they largely fall into a category of individuals who have been really kind of consuming a really crappy Western style diet for a number of years or decades and have incurred adverse developments in body composition and or clinical parameters of health. And so they are really seeking an intervention, an aggressive, a robust, a drastic intervention to kind of reverse the damage that they've done with a with a life of excess. And so carnivore comes in to the rescue, and it frankly does a good job of reversing everything, because it increases satiety, it decreases the opportunities to eat these foods that people were formerly consuming to gross excess, especially the ultra processed, hyper palatable, carb fat combo foods that are just highly engineered to be easily overconsumed. All of that stuff's gone with carnivore. So you're finally getting enough protein. Finally, your diet is mostly whole foods, right? Even if it's a bunch of bull testicles, right? Still whole. It's still whole testicle. And so, um, and so arguably that's an improvement upon your previous diet where you were pounding cheeseburgers and pizza and ice cream and drive through to the tune of like 1 to 2,000 calories a day beyond what you really actually required for the maintenance of health. And so when somebody goes on carnivore, they're finally satiated. They're, like I said, they're finally getting enough protein. They spontaneously eat less calories in the course of a day, in the course of a week, a lot less, because the palatability of their diet goes down, the variety of the diet goes down, the opportunities to overeat go down. And once that happens, then they're sustaining a net caloric deficit. Their body fat goes down. When body fat goes down, even blood lipids improve despite this massive consumption of like saturated fat and cholesterol, because along with body composition improvements, whichever way you decide to do it, there's going to be a tendency towards improvements in blood markers of health as well. And so, uh, it, but of course, it's not optimal. It's not optimal for a number of reasons. So there is essentially a mountain of evidence showing the health benefits of a wide range of plant foods. And when I say plant foods, I'm not necessarily talking about refined flour foods that are you can call vegan because they don't have animal products in them. But I'm talking about fruits, vegetables, um, legumes, tubers, and even whole grains. Even though the whole grain thing is overhyped too, you can get whole grain goldfish, right? It's like what the hell, um, and so it's just not optimal from a nutrient spectrum standpoint to be limiting your options to just a bunch of flesh and balls and such. You know what I mean? So um, there's just a mountain of evidence against the idea of eating that way, but it does represent, in a lot of cases, lesser of the two evils when you compare a carnivore model with a standard gross excess total daily caloric intake that characterizes the Western diet.
Mm, great point. And I think far too often do people use the argument of internal organs to try and meet their micronutrient needs, when the reality is you will have some sort of pitfall with regards to whether you're deficient in certain micronutrients, which is why it's important to ensure you're getting enough fruits and vegetables in, so you're getting a spectrum of all those micronutrients. And um, that's not to say that even if you do eat enough vegetables and fruit, that you won't be deficient in certain vitamins and minerals, and that's where the importance of like a quality multivitamin may potentially come into the picture to provide you with the safety net to get that RDA or recommended amount for certain micronutrients. So in
Mhm.
terms of um, micronutrients, what are some tips you have for the audience to ensure that they're um, not being deficient, but getting within that threshold of the RDA?
Mhm. Yeah, it's a matter of getting the full range of the food groups on most days of the week. And of course, you can skimp out on that and just consume three different foods every day and take a multi, but that's not necessarily going to have the same nutrient spectrum. And I'm not just talking about essential nutrition, but um, non essential nutrients that contribute to health and over the long term prevent chronic disease, things like fiber, the range of phytochemicals that are associated with cancer prevention, um, and you're simply not going to optimize nutrition unless you consume the full range of food groups or close to it. And so when I say the food groups, a lot of people think of the classic, basic four food groups from the 70s and stuff. But it technically there are more food groups than that, and each food group has its own strengths in terms of the nutrients that characterize it. So with the meat and the meat and high protein groups kind of self-explanatory, and then there's the fat group, fats, oils, nuts, seeds, and then fibrous vegetables, or you can call them non-starchy vegetables, and then there's the starch group, which consists of legumes, grains, and tubers, and then the milk and dairy, milk group, um, milk, yogurt, cheese, that sort of thing. Ice cream, well, not really. You know what I mean? That is kind of a form of dairy, but that's more of like superfood dairy, right? And then finally, the fruit group. So each one of those six food groups contains foods that you can acquire unique beneficial nutrition from. And so if you're eating foods within those food groups every day for most days of the week, then you are hedging your bets towards achieving a complete spectrum of not just macronutrition, but micronutrition. And then, of course, I advocate for taking a multivitamin just regardless. I mean, you're going to go through dieting phases. You're going to go through phases where you're consuming a skimpy or poor range of foods and just a very narrow food selection. And of course, people who are sustaining hypocaloric conditions with this narrow range of foods, they're kidding themselves if you're thinking that you're getting or optimizing the full range of essential micronutrients. So that's in a nutshell, that's the way to do it.
Mm, mm. And so we know that variety is especially important for, making sure you're getting enough micronutrients, macrominerals, phytonutrients. But let's switch gears for just a quick second. In the context of something like a competition prep, um, how much will being hmm, diverse with your food selection or having a quite a bit of variety take away from overall adherence of things? Right? Whereas if you're overly strict with things, you have a couple
Yeah.
meals you keep in rotation that may potentially reduce palatability for a bit, but maybe increase long-term
Mm.
adherence.
Yeah, great point, dude. A safe route for competition prep is to keep things simple and not go overboard on the diversity and the options. And the overarching principle there is that physique competition prep is not about health first. It's about looks first. It's about the end result, whose goal is extreme in terms of pushing the envelope of leanness while pushing the envelope of muscular development simultaneously. So it's not about health. It's about achieving a very specific and specialized goal that has very little to do with optimizing diet composition. Okay, so now with that said, um, one way to kind of game the system, where if I may take a couple steps back, the more variety that you consume in your diet of junk foods, of hyper palatable, easily overconsumable foods, the more variety there is with those types of foods, the greater the tendency will be to overconsume total calories. This principle does not apply to fresh fruits and vegetables, interestingly enough. And so you can have a great variety of vegetables and different types of fruits, but it will not result in the passive overconsumption of calories that is common with the sensory specific satiety phenomenon that can occur with more palatable foods, more like higher, like more fat rich, more carb fat rich combo type foods, even savory foods, where, okay, I'm done with the main course, I'm full, but that is sensory specific satiety because I still got room for the sweet stuff now. I still got room for the dessert. And so we can continue on there. And then, yeah, that's more variety of desserts. Oh, that's a different dessert. Let's try that. That sensory specific satiety thresholds don't necessarily apply to fresh fruit and vegetable. So if you wanted to game the system, then keep the variety of your more palatable foods relatively low during prep, but keep the variety of vegetables and fresh fruits high because that'll all dovetail into greater satiety and lower default overall intake. And I actually got that idea from a friend and colleague of mine named Sarah Hartley. So that's credit to her, and she wrote a great paper about that. That's going to be published in my research review in the upcoming issue. So I
Oh,
wanted to give her credit for that.
if you're not already subscribed, go subscribe, and I'm looking forward to seeing that. And
For sure, for sure.
switching gears a bit back to nutrition for longevity. If you have been tapped into the nutrition or health and fitness space, I'm sure you have seen people fear mongering over red flag over the WHO's recent announcement to classify aspartame as a, I believe, class 2B or B2 carcinogen.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I think oftentimes when people see these announcements, they tend to scream and shout. This is proof as to why you shouldn't be drinking Diet Coke or why you shouldn't be using artificial sweeteners in your coffee or your tea or whatever the case may be. And I don't believe we have any human research with regards to the impact of aspartame. And the research that we have is in rodents with, and if you were to equate the dose to the human equivalent, it would be some absurd amount of 20 plus cans of diet soda. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this fear mongering of this recent announcement of aspartame.
Yeah. So in the beginning, the IARC, which is the International Agency for Research on Cancer, that is kind of that's like a working group, a subsidiary, if you will, of the World Health Organization. So they're basically in quotes, an expert panel on the cancer side of what the World Health Organization puts out as public health guidelines. The World Health Organization may be well intentioned, but they're not always correct in their recommendations. They try to be science based, but ultimately, it's almost like an old boys club getting together and trying to make a decision and trying to dictate what how we should perceive reality. Um, they Once upon a time, this was a few years back, they classified coffee in the 2B category as a possible human carcinogen. If my memory serves me correctly, that's what they classified it as. They had to retract that classification and take it out of the possible human carcinogen category based on the evidence, which they were wrong about. So kudos to them on making that retraction. But a bigger picture perspective needs to be applied to the aspartame question, because they did classify aspartame as being in group 2B, which is a possible human carcinogen. And above that, the group 2A, that would be a probable human carcinogen. But and so it's a lower tier. It's the lowest possible tier of possibly, maybe under certain circumstances within animals. So there's no actual human research requirement and no dose specification in terms of the scientific evidence that the IARC uses to classify things within the 2B category. So essentially, what you're looking at with aspartame is astronomical doses in some animal models showing the possibility of carcinogenicity. There's no human data showing this. And um, just to add a little bit more perspective here, alcoholic beverages in any dose, doesn't matter, 1 ounce, 2 ounce, once a week, once a month, it doesn't matter. The IARC classifies um, alcohol consumption in the highest human carcinogen level. So they actually classify it in group 1. So group 1 is the highest evidence level of purported evidence level of human carcinogenicity. They've stuck alcoholic beverages in there. So if you believe what the IARC is saying about these infinitesimal doses of aspartame in your artificially sweetened scoop of protein powder or your diet soda, then you have to be consistent and go, oh gosh, well, my 6 ounces of wine is a class 1 known human carcinogen according to the IARC. So you have to at least be internally consistent. And while you're pooping on folks for having a diet soda on occasion, you better poop on yourself for having 2 glasses of wine a night, because it's a higher level of human carcinogen per the IARC, and you're having more of it. So there's a bunch of perspectives that need to be considered on this topic. And aspartame is one of the most studied substances in human history. And it has one of the longest standing safety track records of any ingredient, any food additive, really in human history. I mean, we have like several decades worth of safety data on it, um, to the point where the acceptable daily intake of aspartame is, if I'm getting this statistic right, it's 40 to 50 milligrams per kilogram of body weight per day. And so for a 75 kilogram individual, this would constitute 17 to 21 cans of diet soda per day, which would still be actually a safe amount to consume in theory, if we're just looking at the aspartame aspect of the product. If we're looking at other things like caffeine, and a drink happens to have 200 milligrams of caffeine, well, of course you're screwed if you consume 17 to 21 cans of it, right? So there are practical limits to what you could and should consume in terms of diet soda per day. I don't personally see it being a problem for the general population to consume, 1 to 2 cans of diet soda in the course of a day, along with their whatever their artificially sweetened protein powder plus their artificially sweetened yogurt or whatever it is. And by the end of the day, you're still hitting only a fraction of what's considered the acceptable daily limit of aspartame intake. Um, yeah, I mean, it is what is. There are much bigger threats in the diet and in the lifestyle as a whole than aspartame. You're looking at a very minuscule potential factor compared to other much bigger factors. I mean, I would put added sugar as being a much bigger threat to the health of the general population than artificially sweetened sodas.
Mm, great point. 0 calories. Made me want to diet
Yeah,
soda.
yeah.
Great point. So, is there, or are you familiar with any data in terms of artificial sweeteners negatively impacting the microbiome or GI?
Yes, there is a body of evidence showing that one particular artificial sweetener is capable of altering the gut microbiota to the degree that it adversely impacts uh, blood glucose control. Okay. Um, However, a couple things, a couple caveats. Number one, it is an artificial sweetener that's virtually commercially extinct. So we're talking about saccharin. So it's very difficult to get saccharin unless you specifically choose the little pink packet in your local diner, your local greasy spoon diner like Denny's or IHOP. You specifically choose the pink packet, the sweet and low. Um, you're just not going to be getting. You're not going to be finding saccharin. In most commercial products have phased saccharin out of their formulations.
Mm,
And so it is saccharin that is kind of potentially a adverse agent for microbiome and glucose control. The adverse effects have been seen in rodents, of course. They replicated this effect in humans when you dished out a serving of about the equivalent of about seven cans of tab or 10 packets of sweet and low, the little pink packet, over a pretty short period. I think they were able to see adverse effects over a week with saccharin. And there's other adverse findings from saccharin in terms of body weight regulation as well. So it's not as if artificial sweeteners are unequivocally and universally a good thing, especially given the negative effects that have been seen with saccharin. But this is just not the case with aspartame. It's just not the case with sucralose. And it's just not the case with stevia either. So,
mm,
and even ACE K, there is a paper looking at over 800 exposures across the human and animal literature and finding no reason to be concerned. And so the artificial sweetener scare is one of those things that is blown way out of proportion. And it's one of those things that is a truly sensationalized, scaremongering thing.
mm. Talking about sensationalized and blood glucose control, and we previously touched on how it doesn't really matter so long as calories are and macros are equated in terms of your approach. Nothing seems to impact fat loss to a great degree. However, you'll get some people on the internet or on TikTok or Instagram that tell you the reason why you can't lose body fat is because you're consuming carbs and it's causing an insulin spike and you need to go get this product to better manage it. And it's something like a GDA, which really they're just trying to increase their profits. So, what are some thoughts or um, feedback you'll have for the audience who tend to think that they can't lose weight because they're causing an insulin spike and they're not being able to utilize that glucose?
Yeah, it's a complete mass neurosis and mass hysteria to think that postprandial glucose response or postprandial glycemia is going to have a meaningful impact on body composition over time if your overall diet is sound and your overall energy balance is on point. So the reason that we can confidently say that this is a non-concern and a very silly thing to be worried about is because there have been two, possibly 3 dozen studies comparing diets with different glycemic effects, different insulinogenic effects. But when you equate calories, when you compare two diets of the same total calories, and you take it a step further and you properly control the experiment by equating protein intakes as well, it doesn't matter which diet is more glycemic than the other. You'll still lose the same amount of body fat, but at the end of the rainbow, you'll still maintain the same type of body composition by the end of the experiment, as long as calories are matched and protein is matched. One diet can have 5% carbohydrate and the other diet can have 45% carbohydrate, 55% carbohydrate, and a low percentage of dietary fat. As long as protein is equated and as long as calories are the same, one diet will, of course, be giving you bigger insulin spikes and bigger glycemic spikes after each meal, but they'll both result in the same dang fat loss by
Mm,
the end of the experiment. And of course, that's an interesting thing, but it's a highly inconvenient finding for people who are fixated on this silly little idea that postprandial glycemia is kind of the key to the thing that you need to worry about and control.
mm. Great points. Yeah, they're just trying to grab money from these people selling snake oil. And speaking of grabbing money from people, we all know that you've been paid out by big seed oil,
Yeah.
and you tend to get a lot of attacks online from people stating that you don't know what you're talking about. So, when it comes to the confusion of seed oil and the impact it has on overall and general health, why don't we go ahead and give the audience some insight there?
Yeah, sure. It's easy to scapegoat a single nutritional or dietary element, um, and blame it for the ills of humanity. That's how our ape slash lizard brains work. We want to simplify what nature really is, and we want to be able to say, this single thing in the diet, all you need to do is avoid it, and then your life will be much better. And you'll avoid disease and you'll avoid heartache and pain. You might even avoid death. But and the seed oil thing is no different. Uh, Seed oil is what the sugar scaremongering was in the 90s and 2000s. You know, um, Seed oil is what dietary fat in general was, as far as being the nutritional scapegoat back in the 1980s. So now we're scaremongering seed oil just like people were scaremongering sugar, like in any amount, right? And so seed oil is the new carbs. Well, that's really kind of hilarious because the only time you're going to be getting seed oil that would be detrimental to health is if you're consuming foods usually in commercial establishment, restaurant, fast food type of establishments where the quality is poor. They're frying and refrying and reusing the oil to serve you basically junk food. And so if you're eating that kind of a diet, if your diet is predominated by fast foods and fried foods and reused oils, you have bigger problems than just the fact that it's seed oil. um, and not only that, but when you compare seed oil used for cooking with butter and lard used for cooking. Guess which type of oil is going to show more favorable health outcomes in the peer-reviewed literature? It's the seed oils that are going to show more favorable outcomes on intermediate markers of health like blood lipids. It's the seed oils, compared to the land animal fats, butter and lard, for example. It's the seed oils that are going to show more favorable outlooks and outcomes in terms of the hard endpoints like cardiovascular disease, mortality. And so it's really the seed oils that are beating out butter and lard in the clinical literature. And so the evidence of seed oils being a bad thing is actually outweighed by the evidence of things like butter and lard being a bad thing. So are we should we scaremonger about butter and lard? No, of course not. I mean, how many people are just eating just a hell of a ton of butter and a ton of lard? Like what populations are we looking at here? You may have bigger problems in your life if that's how you're living. Um, and the evidence that people use to fearmonger seed oils is, like I said, it's always outweighed by the larger body of evidence against high saturated fat type of type. And people can deny it all they want, but then you have to ask them, what is your standard of evidence for your nutritional beliefs? Is it like clips from, a doctor here and there? Or is it the actual evidence basis within the peer-reviewed literature? What is it? What do you base your beliefs on, dude? You know? And then you look at the literature on the various seed oils, sesame oil, canola oil, on down the line. Look at all the damn seeds you want: pumpkin seed, flax seed, chia seeds. You see all this positive stuff, and people are just insane. And frankly, a lot of them are just biased and agenda ridden when they're trying to push that false narrative of seed oils being a uniquely bad thing. It's
Mm.
just fat. It's just fat. I mean, how much of your diet are you going to flood with any given fat? It's like, bro, get a hold of yourself.
We're talking to you, all the people who get your information from Joe Rogan podcasts. and and even though, people may fearmonger seed oils, if your diet is a majority of fast food, processed foods, the Western diet, you struggle with adherence, you struggle with structure within your day, you have bigger things to worry about rather than specific ingredients that are utilized in foods. And switching gears a bit, people tend to be worried about some of these things within their nutrition, but come the weekend, they're binge drinking out of their minds. And even, I have some clients who, they go out on the weekend and one drink turns into 4 or 5 drinks, and then they wonder why their average isn't dropping. And well, it's like, you gotta address the elephant in the room. So when it
Yeah.
comes to alcohol consumption, and its impact on overall health, obviously we know that the dose makes the poison, but from some of the literature that I've read, I've seen reduced rates of fat oxidation. Our body stops partitioning and doesn't completely stop, but it reduces partitioning of other nutrients until alcohol is out of the system. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I'm sure the audience would, about alcohol's impact on long-term health.
Yeah, the alcohol question is a big one because there is the potential for addiction and substance abuse weaved in to that question. And so, with something like alcohol, the majority of the general population will be able to stay healthy on as much as an average of 1 to 2 drinks a day. So that is considered in quotes, healthy moderation, statistically anyway, at the general population level, with smaller folks being able to get away with a drink a day and larger folks being able to get away with a couple drinks a day on average. And you can live a ripe, long, healthy life. And in fact, there's some literature showing an enhancement of health from wine consumption at the rate of 1 to 2 drinks a day. Of course, that's counterbalanced with stuff that doesn't show any particular benefit, but the bottom line is it's not necessarily a bad thing. Now, for the minority of the population who can't have 1 to 2 drinks a day and that escalates to 1 to 2 bottles a day, well, then they're kind of screwed if they read the literature and went, oh, this is fine. I'll try this. And so that's the treachery there, is just the potential for addiction in a small percentage of the population. Now, I have to also say that at the general population level, one of the biggest contributing factors to the obesity epidemic, and one of the most underappreciated and overlooked factors in the obesity pandemic worldwide, and also a contributor to diabetes because of the accumulation of body fat from the excess calories from alcohol, is people's drinking habits. A lot of people who drink even recreationally can take down 2 to 3 thousand calories of alcoholic beverage in a single weekend day. If you do that on Friday and Saturday nights, then you got an extra 6,000 calories worth of drinking that you're adding to the week, and that can sustain a significant caloric surplus over time. Um, and it's not necessarily the good kind of caloric surplus that gets partitioned straight into the fibras, you know. So, yeah, that's a good thing to bring up because a lot of people miss that.
Mm, great points. Great points. And in short, don't go binge drink on the weekend because you're going to blow out your deficit out of the water when you could actually be consuming that through actual food.
Yeah,
But the
yeah.
dose makes the poison. Just be aware of your alcohol consumption. And obviously, don't drink and drive. And when it comes to the importance of balance within a nutritional protocol, for most of my clients, I don't create any sort of restrictions. I generally tell them 80-20 rule, have those fun foods in terms of long-term adherence. But when it comes to things like restriction, obviously some people are, going to restrict themselves from consuming certain foods. And this leads them into developing some sort of thought suppression for that food. And they have an increased thought frequency and desire for wanting to consume what they're in fact not trying to think about. So, in
Mm.
terms of incorporating some sort of balance and better structure with some quote unquote trigger foods, what are some tips you have for the audience?
Yes, that is a great question and a great topic. Before I hit that, and I'm making a note for myself so I don't forget what you asked. I wanted to mention that alcohol consumption can hinder goals in at least a couple other ways other than the potential for addiction and the superfluous calories that people consume, is that it will tend to affect training, training performance, especially next day. And it will also have a tendency to degrade sleep quality. So when you degrade sleep quality and quantity, and you degrade training capacity, those two things can serve as significant hindrances to the pursuit of people's physical goals. Um, and of course, there's other things with alcohol that get people in a whole lot of trouble that are pretty obvious. Self-awareness kind of can go down to zero. Situational awareness goes down to zero. And people just have to be careful with it. People who don't have enough respect for the destructive potential of alcohol will find themselves in a world of hurt, in many ways, many possible ways. So, okay, so the question you asked about foods that trigger binges, how do people manage kind of the idea of allowing the consumption of these foods without going off the rails and without going overboard and it triggering the consumption of like 3, 4, 5,000 calories of it in a single sitting. Um, it begins with changing your perspective of the food. So when I say that, I mean a healthy perception of, let's say, potato chips is, well, these are just, you know, deep fried potatoes that are crunchy and savory and potentially yummy for the munchies. Um, that's what it is. It's a food and it's calorically dense. And it's highly palatable. It's easy to overeat. Okay, that would be a healthy perception of a bag of potato chips. An unhealthy perception of a bag of potato chips, which would lead to binging on it, would be this. It's a bag of potato chips. Boy, do I love it, but I know I can never have any of it. Not even one, not even two. I just can never have it. Because if I do, I'll have to eat the whole bag because I know that I'll try to never have it ever again for at least a year or at least 6 months. So that would be an unhealthy perception of a food that could be a trigger food. The same type of scenario would apply to desserts, you know, to a bag of cookies, to some cake, or to some ice cream, or even to savory stuff like pizza. Um, Thinking, ooh, pizza, that's a bad food. That's an evil food. I'm a very naughty and evil person when I eat pizza, so I shall never have it. Versus saying, all right, pizza is a hyper palatable food. It's very yummy, potentially easy to overeat, especially if you have the munchies after a night of drinking or whatever. Um, I like pizza. I'll have one, two, possibly three slices if I kind of plan for it. You know, if I made the necessary adjustments in the day to fit in those calories. Now, that's a healthy way to look at these types of foods. So if you can remove yourself and recondition your mind from viewing any food as forbidden fruit or not allowed or something I can never have, then that is the root of what would remove the binging behavior. So, in a nutshell, change the way you view the food. And if somebody were to insist that I've got trigger foods, this is a trigger food, that's a trigger food, no matter what, you know, no matter how you know much I try to moderate these things, if they get in front of me, I'm going to mow through it. I'm going to mow through the whole bag. So, okay, you can either choose to maintain that perception, or you can choose to take the approach of maybe I need to recondition my perception of these foods. And when I am finally able to remove the taboo mystique or the forbidden fruit mystique from these foods, I can give the power to myself instead of giving all the power to the foods.
Mm.
And that is a much more deep-seated and potentially permanent and practical way of mitigating the binge response rather than just any which way but loose, trying to keep the foods out of the house, trying to avoid the foods, trying to stay in a different room from the foods, and that, and that sort of thing. And there is there's sort of a sub conversation there about the literature looking at what happens when you um, try to moderate foods versus avoid them. And indeed, when certain foods are avoided, then you start losing the craving for them. And that's true. But these studies only last a matter of weeks or months at most. And the literature on weight regain almost always involves these foods that you tried to avoid completely. And so there's a bigger problem there to look at, and there's potentially a better solution there than simply avoid, 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 keep it out of the house, stay in a different room from, but while still looking at these foods as forbidden fruits and definite triggers.
Mm. Great points. Great points. I think it's always going to come down to a game of perception, and then it's also a game of time and retraining yourself in terms of how you think about foods. And
Mhm.
just to reiterate, there's no good foods or bad foods, but foods that have more or less nutritional value, foods that are more palatable than others, and really taking yourself out of the lens of viewing things from a black and white perspective will pay big dividends when it comes to making sure you're not in that binge restriction cycle or you're not yo-yo dieting for eternity. And to round off this conversation, Alan, I first want to thank you for your time. But before I let you go, how do you think we can collectively make an effort to make people more food aware about making smarter
Mhm.
decisions?
Well, I think that one of the big steps people can make is just adopting the perception, the accurate perception that a healthy diet can still contain a minority of, in quotes, unhealthy foods. So if 80 to 90% of your diet would please your, your local clean eating guru guy, and then 10 to 20% of it is, whatever, honestly, whatever you want, you're still consuming a diet that's 80 to 90% wholesome and healthy and mostly whole, minimally refined. And you still have that 10, 20% leeway for indulgence, fun foods, rebellious foods, sanity. Um, and so it's, and there's literature actually supporting the idea that when you don't view foods as dichotomous entities, like this food is angelic, this food is evil, this food is to be consumed ad nauseum, this food is to be avoided. When you when you have a more balanced view of things, not only do you have better regulation of body weight, but you have better control over mitigating the potential for developing an eating disorder. And I guess that's kind of the bigger picture of how I would want people to perceive the diet in terms of what's healthy.
Mm, go have some angelic ice cream, everyone.
Yeah, right. I just had some of that just recently. It was pretty damn good.
Oh man, I gotta go bust open the salt and vinegar chips in my pantry right now. But
Oh, snap.
to really close
Pre-workout.
this, yeah, pre-workout. Oh, today's a rest day, thankfully. But I gotta go get that cardio in, huh? But
Okay, do what you got to do, man.
to close off this episode, team, go get you a copy of Flexible Dieting by Alan Aragon. Go subscribe to his research review if you are a fit pro or you just want to learn more about these topics. He does a really great job diving into them. And Alan, I want to thank you for coming on again and talking to us and taking us to school. It's always a pleasure to chat with you. You're super down to earth and you break everything down really easy for people to digest.
Isak, thank you so much for the convo, man. I love what you're doing for the industry. I love how you're able to communicate and just reach out to the audience and just improve lives. So I really appreciate that, man.
Thanks so much for your time. If you enjoyed the episode, team, don't forget to take a screenshot and hit us with it on your stories. And Alan, we'll talk soon. Bye bye.
Take care, buddy.